everybody, and welcome back to my channel After Dark Coffee and Crime. If you are new to my channel, I just want to say hi and welcome, and if you have watched me before, then obviously I'm super happy to see you back here again. So today's case, we are going to look at the mass shooting that happened on the 1st of October back in 2017, and this incident occurred at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival, and this was held along the Las Vegas Strip in Nevada, and it was not situated far from the Mandalay Bay Hotel. But before I get into today's case, I just want to give you guys my normal content warning, because we are going to be talking about a mass shooting, and obviously there was a lot of people injured during this mass shooting, and there were a great number of deaths as well. And as I go through the podcast like I would normally do, I'll be showing images and sharing clips from the news that was being aired at the time of the incident. So if this is something that you find difficult to listen to right now, that's absolutely fine. We totally understand that. Obviously you must look after yourself, so we say switch off out of this podcast, and hopefully we will see you on our next one. And as usual, the information that I am discussing here has been information that I've sourced either from the internet, news articles, news features, and I have also accessed the Discovery, which is the official police report, the final report after the incident, and it goes into great detail about what happened, who attended, and things like that. So lots of the information I have taken from there, but obviously I have pulled stuff from other sources, and so obviously, like with everything else, this is intended to give information and be just a source of educational information for people who want to listen, and it is not intended to obviously upset anyone who may know someone who was there, who may have been there, who may have been injured, or any one of the relatives of somebody that sadly lost their lives in that incident. So if you have been here before, I do like to give some background information of some of the people that I'm talking about, and usually I would give information on the victims who were involved, just because we're telling their story, and where I can, I talk about the actual perpetrator, the murderer, whoever is responsible for carrying out what takes place. So with this podcast, there's going to be more information based on the shooter, Stephen Paddock. There were so many victims, including there was over 800 victims who were injured, and there were 60 people that lost their lives, so it would be so difficult to go through each and every one of those and find the information on those. Obviously they are in America as well, so it is quite difficult. So what I would do normally at the end is go through the victims, play them some music and share a little bit about them. So I won't be able to do that specifically in this podcast, but what I aim to do is to list the names of the people that passed away, and obviously put the group photo on, and obviously there's 800 people, but obviously they survived, and they were injured, so and I wouldn't be able to get all of the information, but for the majority of the people who passed away, information can be found, so I want to pop that on the end there where I can. So as I mentioned, the person that is responsible for what happened that day is Stephen Paddock, and at the time he was aged 64, and he actually lived in Mesquite, Nevada, and he also had a place in Reno in Nevada with his partner Mary Lou Danley. So one thing about Stephen Paddock that I've picked up, and what I picked up at the time of the incident, is that he was actually very wealthy, and he had a couple of properties in different places. He was a big gambler. We know from what I've sourced and what I've read, he did graduate high school. And then he went to work for the USA Postal Services, and he also then went on to work with the IRS, and he also had a background in accounting. What transpires as this goes through, and you'll see when I show, there was an interview with his brother, but from what I gather and from what I've seen and read, gambling was more like a job for him. He was known to be very good at it. He would spend $100,000 in a night, so to him that was not a lot of money. And that's how Stephen actually met his partner Mary Lou, because she was working at a casino as a hostess for the Club Paradise at the Atlantis Casino in Reno. So they met there while he was gambling, and he was so good at what he was doing. He would get free rooms, he would be comped rooms, he would be comped meals. He will have been known to the places where he would go and gamble, and so he had a good life with it, and he shared that life with his family. And he also, where he was comped, where they'd go out, he'd have family with him and they'd go out and eat meals and things. So for him it was a professional thing that he was doing, and it is what paid his way in life, and he helped his family's situations and improve theirs as well. So Stephen was one of 4 brothers, and a couple of them had interviews, and one of his brothers, Bruce Paddock, he was interviewed.
I saw that that CNN and every channel had this shooting, and I looked again, and they said Stephen Paddock, and I said, "What?" So I called my mom, and my mom answered the phone, and I said, "Is that Steve?" And she said, "I guess so." And I asked her, was he sick like me?
And then Eric Paddock was interviewed. Now, he gave the longest interview, and I found him to be a little bit unusual, but that could be shock. Because of what happened, because I think he went out and gave the interview, but obviously you'll be able to see that yourself when I play the video.
We were bad kids. Someone said that Steve transferred $100,000. Woo, $100,000. We're wealthy people. $100,000 isn't that much money, A, and I'm sorry if that hurts people or something, but $100,000 isn't that huge amount of money. He gambled that much through a machine in hours. I mean, once again, you need to understand. That's what people need to understand, the level where some people live. I guess everybody thinks that everybody works at Taco Bell or something. Everybody doesn't work at Taco Bell. Steve made my mom wealthy. He's the reason why he's not the only reason. She did this herself, a lot of it, okay? But he helped make her retirement very comfortable. He's the reason she's very, very comfortable right now. She wouldn't have been as comfortable because you don't make much money as a secretary in the 70s, raising 4 kids, okay? That's, at some level. We were troublesome kids. Grew up poor on the side of the freeway in the San Fernando Valley in California. I don't want to go too much into this, but how we were formed. We're just people. My mom has had a tough life, and here's where it goes in, where it branches into Steve.
All of the boys were raised by their mum, and she'd spent most of her life with them as a single parent, and that is because their father had been arrested for bank robbery, and he was serving time, but then his dad ended up on the run. So already there's a very chaotic lifestyle. His brother Eric describes him from his relationship with him, and I believe he was one of the only brothers he made in contact with. But he said that his brother was a nice person. He he adored Mary Lou, and when this happened, we learnt very quickly that he had sent Mary Lou a lump sum payment because she was actually visiting her family in the Philippines. So his brother said that would be the type of thing he'd do. He liked to take care of people. He liked to take care of his family. He took care of his mum. And this payment that he made was actually sent just days before the actual shooting. So we know Mary Lou was his girlfriend, and she was born in 1954. She had children from a previous relationship, but she had been a long-term girlfriend of Stephen Paddock. And as I mentioned, Eric, said that they were a nice couple, but other people outside of the family and outside of who knew them, so they used to go and get drinks from Starbucks quite regularly in Vegas, and one of the staff who was interviewed actually said he was verbally abusive towards her. He would belittle her in front of them. So it's always very interesting to me when you've got the family person saying, he was great, he looked after her, that's why he sent her the money, they seemed good together, that kind of thing. But you get a different picture from people who don't know them. So, interestingly, as I said, his brother perceives him as kind and caring, and he says that he idolises her, and, he doesn't... He still doesn't understand how this played out and why it played out. Mary Lou was from the Philippines, but she did have Australian citizenship, and when they managed to get her back into the States, she had no clue that he was going to do this, and she said there was no signs. He didn't tell her, he didn't leave a message, he didn't do anything that might indicate to her that he was going to carry out this atrocity. So what I was able to see, that Mary Lou, she was complicit. She was asked to return back to the United States after the incident, and she did, and she was met by FBI agents because obviously they wanted to know as much as they could, because what happened was just awful, and they obviously needed to exclude any part of her participation in what happened. And as I said, their dad, Benjamin Hoskins Paddock, was incarcerated for robbery, and then he escaped and went on the run, and therefore that meant that his mum was bringing them up on her own as a single mum. It's also known that Benjamin Paddock was diagnosed as a psychopath. He had suicidal tendencies, and he just, those children didn't have the best start, and it was very much said that Eric took the role of the father. But he was also known to be egotistical and arrogant, which is how people described Stephen. So he kind of has similar traits to what his dad has. His brother Bruce, who was only 58 at the time, was residing in California, and he said, that Stephen used to get beaten up, and then they stopped speaking and having communication. His main communication and relationship was with his brother Eric, and in the end, Bruce had actually been arrested after what happened for being in possession of child porn. And they found that he'd been collecting this porn over an 8-month period, and he was charged 19 of 20 counts of this misdemeanor. So again, somebody else who's kind of gone on to do something that is not okay and is illegal. So as you see this picture, this picture's just kind of building up of this kind of family that's not, there's things that aren't quite right, and things have happened, and things have obviously built up over time. And that's something that when we look at these things, we ask ourselves if we can attribute it to what happened. Initially, when he had found out what Stephen had done, he said that it was very shocking, and he was upset, and he was upset that obviously there was people hurt and there was killed, but after time he then changed his sort of views on that, and he then decided that he was going to consider as though his brother had never existed, so totally kind of just discounting that he was his brother and that all this had happened. And in the early stages, like Eric, there was no explanation. No one could give an explanation as to why what pans out. Everybody just seemed to be in total shock, and they can give us some insight to what has happened and what he did, but not much, because at the end of this case, you'll see, is quite frustrating. He did try to give some explanations that could have been something that was sort of contributing. So he said that he had spinal problems, and he was in pain, and he thinks maybe that might have triggered him to do what he did, because it's like long-term pain. He believes Stephen is controlling, and I kind of feel a bit like that's true when I've been kind of sort of watching and learning about what happened, and even down to how he carried everything out. There's a strong bit of control there, and he believed, as this was about to happen, he said that he thinks that his brother was losing some control. There was rumours that he had lost money, which, if he's the person that is helping people and giving them money, that could be of an embarrassment to him maybe. But that was one of the rumours that came about and was thrown around as to one of the reasons why he may have done what he did. Even with the control aspect, at the end you'll see everything he did was controlled and actually quite controlling. When Stephen Paddock committed this mass shooting, he was 60. He'd previously been an engineer, and his original birthplace was in Iowa, and he was originally living with his mum Irene. As I said, she was a single mum. It's been said that he was the least violent of the family. So again, because of that, there's a lot of shock about what he did and why he did it. It's really difficult for families when they've never seen this coming to know why this has happened, because they lose their loved one, but they're also in conflict with the fact of the damage they've done and the people that they've murdered, and they just don't sometimes see that come in, so it's a big shock for them, and I do understand that. Stephen's mum, Irene, she had a good relationship with Stephen and Eric. Like I said, they did continue and maintain a relationship, and he used to visit his mum regularly. She was 90 when this happened, and it came to such a big shock to her, and she'd looked after them, she'd given them everything, she'd brought them up, and at the age of 90 she learns that her son turns out to be a cold-blooded killer. There's not much other than what I've kind of covered that we know about the boys, but the main thing that I can gather is that, you know, they were like normal children when in the past, you know, they'd had some times where they misbehaved. So, you know, they just seem to be normal people in the community. Even, you know, when he's gambling, he's a normal person in the gambling community. He, you know, became his mum's sole kind of, like, he was the person that was responsible for keeping her afloat, and you know, he'd been giving her money, and at the end of this, it was said that the mum had refused to obviously take any of the money because she was the sole heir of his estate, but she wanted everything of that value to go to the victims of the shooting. So she handed that to the victims. She was just totally in shock, and I feel like she did the right thing there, and there could be many reasons why she's done that. But, you know, in your 90s, you never expect that this is ever going to happen, and that she's going to lose her son and find out that he is a mass murderer. So we can see already, before we get going, that there's a lot of different dynamics in this family. You know, now the mum raised them as a single parent, and she worked a lot to provide them with what they need, and that's not, you know, any reason for giving him for what he did, why he did what he did. But other factors come into play, like, you know, his dad was a criminal, his dad escaped prison, so he didn't have that relationship there, and by all accounts, when the dad was not in prison, he didn't make the effort to, you know, go and make up with his children or go see them or have a relationship with them. So it was very strained, and that can be very damaging and have a long lasting effect on your mental well-being. And obviously his dad's a criminal, so there is that kind of element in there of the criminal behaviour, obviously on a very different level, but they've both displayed it. So what I'll do is I'm going to play some of the interview with Eric. I'm not going to play the whole thing, one because of copyright, and it's about 30 minutes long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a taste of the interview so you can see how he responds, what he says, how he feels about everything, and then I'm going to pop the link to that video into the messaging section and the comments, so that if anyone wants to go and watch that in full, they then can.
No. And I don't want to talk much more. This is all, once again, what I'm telling you is all part of the record. He has no police record. He doesn't even have parking tickets, probably.
How did you hear that he was?
We got phone calls. The Las Vegas PD were cooperating with the cops. We have talked to the PD. This is like you called me up and said, your next door neighbor did this. And I go, wow, my next door neighbor did that. All I've ever seen him do is mow his yard. The fact that my brother did this is, there's nothing. There's not even anything I can say. I mean, how do you... I mean, my brother did this. This is like it was done, you know, like he shot us. I mean, if he'd have killed my kids, I couldn't be more dumbfounded. I mean, it doesn't... There's nothing.
Last communication.
There's nothing.
After the hurricane.
I mean, I can show you the text. He said, you know, how's mom? Did you get power? You know, I mean, that was it. There's absolutely, we have nothing. Like I said, we have nothing for you.
And it'd be interesting, as I said, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on his behaviour. It was all very bizarre to me. The way he held himself, the way he spoke. And it kind of gave me an insight into Stephen, because of the fact that they'd said Stephen was a bit of an odd character, and we know that his dad also was sort of self-centered and arrogant, and Stephen could be seen to come across like that. And so before we get to the night of the 1st of October, there's a little bit of a build-up and a background. So I've managed to pull this from the Discovery, and it is interesting, and I feel it is important to mention it because at the time, the main focus was where he was staying when he did it and what he did, the casualties, the deaths, and the aftermath of what happened. But actually there's some very interesting things that had happened with Stephen leading up to him doing what he did, leaving people to question whether or not he'd actually planned to do this more than one time. So there is no absolute knowledge that he may have been planning to do this more than once, but it certainly appears that way. And everything he does is meticulous. So he's, all the things that he's done leading up to what happened, he's actually planned them to be doing them. But let's go to June of that year, where obviously when they're looking through his history post-mortem and all the rest of it, they looked at his medical records, and it had shown that he had been prescribed diazepam, and one of the side effects of diazepam is it may cause aggression. So that was noted because, is this something that he was taking that is kind of over time built up and it's led into the aggression? And obviously that was a few months beforehand, so it's difficult to know if he was still taking the medication, if he'd stopped taking it, he was half taking it, if he'd been taking the right amount, if he'd not been taking enough. But at that point he'd been prescribed it, so we can assume that maybe he was taking it, and maybe, we don't know 100%, it can only be speculated that maybe this led to some aggressive behaviour. We then know in the beginning of September of that year, he actually then purchased a ticket for Mary Lou to go to visit her family in the Philippines. So he's done that. He's, got her over there, and she's now not in the United States. And so a lot of the questions around this was, had he already mentally planned for her not to be around? Because of the fact of the timing of when she was sent over there. And I kind of feel like even if she didn't know this was going to happen, or no inclination, that this was definitely planned, so she was not in the country. I don't think he wanted her to get dragged into being blamed for this, despite some of the things that I've read about his arrogance and what he said. I do think there will have been an element that he loved her, and he probably was quite showy to her in front of his brother and stuff. But she went off in September to go visit her family, and we question whether he'd mentally planned this at this time. His brother Eric says that with him, he will always strive to be the best at everything. So if he was going to do this, he wanted to be the person that would have done it the best, that he would have got the biggest casualties and caused the most chaos and upset. So obviously keeping her out of the way helps him to do that, and obviously helps him to do what he did. So, we come to learn that he had planned this out. There were diagrams of the measurements from the distance from the room that he was in, because he was in a specific room. So it was well planned, and I guess with her not being there, that gives him the freedom to, keep his plans out on the table and do whatever it was he was doing. Whereas if he was kind of doing that at the time at the table and she was home, she'd be asking him questions, and he's not going to want that. So we ask, was she sent away, completely unknowing? But we know she wasn't there, and she was quite complicit and helped with the police inquiries. So we know on the 15th of September, Mary Lou arrives in Manila, and then for some reason she goes to Hong Kong on the 22nd of September, and then she heads back to Manila on the 25th, which I find very weird. That's a long way to go for a couple of days. When she had initially gone there to see her family. So I'm not sure what that little trip was about. And while she was there, as I said, he'd wired her a good lump sum payment, and that was to purchase a property for her and her family. So again, I kind of feel that he was trying to make sure she was okay. And she actually said in the interviews when she was here in the States that she thought he was ending their relationship, and that's why he sent her away, and that's why he sent the money for her to buy a property over there. As we go on, this is where it gets more interesting, and it's very, very interesting in the fact that you have to wonder if this was then planned to be more than one event. So on the 17th of September, Paddock, he checks into a place called the Ogden, and he'd booked this right through to the 22nd of September. And this location was actually in the vicinity of the Life is Beautiful festival, and that had planned to run from the 22nd to the 24th of September. And during his stay, he'd booked himself in a luxury condo, and he stayed in 3 different units while he was there, and he had started some odd behaviours, and so you have to wonder if he had planned on actually committing something as at the Ogden, as well as the main location where he did. He is seen on the 18th of September, so the next day, in the early hours of the morning, removing a bag from the vehicle that he had, and that was at 4:28, and he was seen with a suitcase at 4:45, and he'd been having a conversation with the concierge whilst he was in possession of the suitcase. He then went and took a ride to the McCarran International Airport, which again is a bit weird, especially with it being the timings that they are. And that's when he then caught a flight between 6 and 7:30 back to Reno. So he'd gone to the hotel, he'd checked in, he'd put his luggage in there. It was all in the early hours of the morning. It was all very odd. And while staying in the accommodation, we learn he was back and forth quite a bit, which you'll see as we go through. And what I will say is, even though his behaviour is strikingly odd, it's only when you watch something back do you know what the problem was, that you see the problem, that you see what you missed, because he will have been in a casino, it will have been busy, not everyone's good, there's going to be changeover with staff, not everyone's going to be paying attention, and he blended in. So at this point, there is nothing that raises any suspicion that he is up to anything at all. But what we can see now on reflection, when they've looked at the information, it's actually quite scary, and it looks like he'd planned on doing what he did at the Ogden, but as we find out, that's not what happened, but we see that there is similar patterns and behaviours of what he's doing while he is staying over there. Now, he could have just been out there, you know, just checking out what the situation is and, you know, what he can and can't do, depending on what room he was in. It was speculated as well, but when he was off on his way out, September the 19th, that he'd gone to Reno and then he'd gone on and travelled to Phoenix. And he actually purchased ammunition from a guy called Douglas Haig, and he then drove back. So he took a flight and then he drove back, but there could be a reason that he took a flight back to where he lived. He actually picked the car up at 3:05, and when he went to the shop, he bought 600 rounds of .308 more piercing incendiary ammunition. Now, I don't know if I said that right, but it's the type of ammunition that he bought. And then he heads back and goes back to the Ogden, and he then brings in his laptop and another suitcase. On September the 20th, before the event happens, he travels between Vegas and Mesquite, and he is seen at midnight, parking back at the Ogden with his laptop bag and his suitcase. And then he moves his Chrysler, which is his car, back up to the 5th floor of the garage, and he parks the rental on the 2nd floor. So it's all very bizarre, but I guess, you know, until you look back at the CCTV and stuff like that, it's really difficult. You know, it's difficult for them to even get any weird vibe from him, because people are around these places in the early hours of the morning. You know, that's what they do when they go to Vegas. It's open pretty much 24/7, and you can gamble to your heart's content, and so people are coming and going all the time. But it is all odd behaviour, and he rented the car, and he's going back and forth just doing things that aren't at that time pieced together. And they don't get pieced together until, you know, what plays out happens. And, you know, it's acknowledged that he just blended in where he was. Just before 1 o'clock in the morning, he returns the hire car back into the Ogden, and it's dropped near the ride and share area, and it says a lot of his hours, and that's what I've read through Discovery and things like that, a lot of his time awake and wandering around was always in the early hours of the morning. Just before 1 o'clock in the morning, he returns the hire car back into the Ogden, and it's dropped near the ride and share area, and it says a lot of his hours, and that's what I've read through Discovery and things like that, a lot of his time awake and wandering around was always in the early hours of the morning. So, you know, like I said, it's not going to raise suspicion. It is a bit weird, but you know what it's like. If you're on holiday, you can't sleep, you go for a wander around, it wouldn't be very unusual. Even if the hotels and the casinos were quiet in the early hours, it still wouldn't necessarily scream at anyone that he's up to no good. And then on the 21st of September, he goes between Mesquite and Vegas. He then checks into Unit 1220 at the Ogden, and he's then scheduled to come out of there on the 24th. And he's just back and forth. There's a lot of back and forth. There's much more back and forth. I'm not going to go through every step, but you can see that, you know, he's up to something. He's planned something, and he's been back and forth like a yo-yo, back between home and the place that he's staying. On the 22nd of September, when they go back and look at everything, it is noted that he has done multiple online searches on the event that is going to be happening before, obviously, the events take place. And he's also looking for a update on things on the 28th. And this begins to overlap with his stay at the Mandalay Bay. On the 25th of September, through into the 2nd, we know that Stephen Paddock has checked himself into the Mandalay Bay, and that's the duration that he is booked in there to stay. And he is booked into room 135, and he puts this room in his name. And it's like a corner suite. So when you look at the diagrams that I'm going to show you above, it's like on the corner. And so it's also a very big room. And there's also the option to have an interconnecting joining room. And that becomes important as we work our way through the sequence of the events that are unfolding. At this point, when they've looked back at the case, they've seen and noted, they've gone around the room, they've seen what armoury he's got, and he's got a lot. He had around 23 guns in there, and there is CCTV footage of Stephen Paddock bringing luggage in and bringing luggage out back and forth, and he does leave the Mandalay Bay a couple of times to go visit Mesquite, and above you can see him on that CCTV. And the thing is, you know, when they ask questions about him and his behaviour, you know, they were very much, he blended in, like he didn't raise suspicion. And as I've said, throughout his trips back and forth to the casinos, you know, casinos are busy places, they are open all of the time, people are coming and going. One person, especially an older gentleman, isn't going to raise suspicion, you know, and he's back and forth, and you know, he's just not on the radar. And I imagine with the back and forth that he's doing, it just makes it less obvious, you know, because obviously the staff at the hotel aren't going to be watching people coming in and out. It'd be impossible. So it's noted on the 27th that he's been gambling. You know, he's wandering around the casino, he's blending in. And on that day, he actually goes to the VIP desk, because he's a VIP because, as we know, he spends lots of money. He gets everything comped for him. He's a big gambler, and so he's a VIP, and he asks to have a connecting room, and he's very specific that he wants that room as well. And the VIP host, when you know, questioned, said that he was more upset about the room, and you know, there was no mention of why he wanted it. And again, he wouldn't have been seen as fishy, I wouldn't have thought, because of his age. You know, he looks like an average gentleman. He's a regular gambler. He's big stakes. They're not going to think he wants that room because he's going to do something he shouldn't, or something that's going to create, you know, a massacre at the end of it. They're not going to be thinking that. They're probably just thinking he's a high stake gambler, and he just wants the room that he wants. He's been very stubborn, and they're going to try and accommodate him the best that they can. And so, you know, that does actually happen, and he books that room in Mary Lou's name. On the 28th of September, Paddock purchases a 308 bolt action rifle. Then he goes on to deposit $14,000 into Wells Fargo. That's an account of his, and then he transfers money to the Philippines to Mary Lou. He goes back to Mesquite, And we can see, you know, he's here, there and everywhere. He's transferring money, and obviously no one's aware of him transferring that money. And the ones that are aware of the money going into the accounts, like Mary Lou, she doesn't have a clue what he's doing back at the hotel. And why would she? I don't know whether when he was purchasing multiple guns at that gun store and ammunition, whether that would have raised suspicion. And again, I think that's why they interviewed the guy who run the store, or who sold those particular guns. But you know, obviously not, because he purchased them and, you know, he had them. And I know some of them he purchased over a period of time, but he did go in and do that bulk order for ammunition. On September the 29th, Stephen Paddock, again, he's gambling, and then that's the day he checks into the Suite 134, which is the interconnecting room, which is the room he puts in Mary Lou Danley's name. And he has that from about 3 o'clock on that day. So we're getting close to the 1st of October. And on this particular day, he actually remains in that room. And he actually puts, you know, the service signs that people have if they don't want room service and they don't want to be disturbed, that kind of thing. He actually puts that on the door. Then on the 30th, he has that do not disturb sign on the door on both of the rooms. But he does go back within a couple of hours with more suitcases. And again, you know, he's got a double room. He's booked it in his partner's name. It's interconnected. So they could just be thinking that he's taking up suitcases for her. You know, they're not necessarily going to know who she is, who's going in that room. But we can see it's not clear from where he was going backwards and forwards from the Ogden, you know, shipping suitcases back and forwards, staking that out, whether or not he had planned to complete a massacre there. That's something that we'll never get to know, and we'll never get to find out. He may have planned to, but something may have scupped those plans, or he may have, you know, it just may not have been what he would have wanted for the numbers that he wanted, because we know that his brother Eric said, you know, if he does this, he wants to have the biggest mass casualties. And if he's not going to get that at the Ogden in the room that he's in, and he's obviously will have weighed all this up, maybe that's why he didn't, or whether he planned on doing that and then moving swiftly over to the Mandalay Bay. It's very possible, but something obviously put a halt on those plans, because obviously he didn't do anything at the Ogden. And we're going through, and you know, we will learn about the planning that's gone behind this, because the discovery is really in depth. And I have got images that show where his room is situated and the distance to the open air concert, and the angles of which, you know, when he's spraying the bullets, that where they're going to be going. And you can see he's planned that meticulously, and you know, there is like a note or something that they find in his suite that shows like he's done some, you know, working out there too. So he's worked this out. He knows his intended targets, and he's got all of his equipment ready. And then we come to the tragic day of the 1st of October. A day that, you know, people, you know, they'd been enjoying this festival. It was coming to, you know, the end of the festival, and this is the day that everything goes wrong for those people. So as we know, this is the last day of the Route 91 Harvest Festival, and It's near the Mandalay Bay. It's on the right hand, to where Stephen Paddock's room is, which you can see above on the pictures that I've shared with you. The Las Vegas Route 91 Arts Festival is held on the Vegas Boulevard Strip, so it was completely open air. There were food tents. There was a VIP tent. Then there was the stage, and you'll see the layout in the pictures. And you can just see from the room that he is in down to the concert area how exposed those people really were. And here is like a small clip of obviously the initial part of the concert before we get into the massacre of people. You can just kind of see how open it is, and how vulnerable people were, because they're just enjoying themselves. They're drinking, they've had 3 days, and they're never in their wildest dreams expecting this to happen. So just before Stephen Paddock carries out his mass shooting, Jason Aldean was one of the last performers that was going to be playing on the stage, and he was scheduled to go live at 21:40. In this area there is around 22,000 people, and that's without people that weren't attending the concert that would have been in that boulevard area. There could have been some out of the concert grounds, there could have been some in the VIP area, there could have been dotted about everywhere, but the sadness of it is that the entire area was just so exposed. So we've got Jason Aldean on the stage, so I'm going to now go through and I'm going to give the times to what the Discovery said happened and the times that they said them, so you can see how that this pans out. The Discovery files are really good. If you want the Discovery files, you can look for them. Just be warned that there is photographs of Stephen after he's taken his own life. So if that's something that you don't want to see, then I wouldn't recommend that you go through it, because they just appear, because you're getting the room photos of the ammunition. It's the crime scene basically. So if that's something that's a bit too much for you, then you aren't going to want to. But if you are someone that has a strong stomach, and you are interested in reading through the Discovery, it's really big. I highly recommend it, because you'll get the full facts as they have been documented in the final briefing that they've written in there. So as we go through, Stephen Paddock on that day of the 1st of October is out and about. He's out from 2 a.m. He returns from Mesquite. Prior to that, he'd been from the Mandalay Bay back to Mesquite. He's back and forth, and on his return there's more suitcases coming in, but again, that's what I mentioned earlier, like it hasn't raised any suspicions, because he's got the other room, and again it's busy. They probably think he's just, I don't know, taking his suitcase to his car and then bringing the same suitcase back. It's not gonna raise an eyebrow, to be honest. Looking now and looking at the CCTV footage in hindsight, yes, it looks very suspicious, but hindsight is a wonderful thing. So as he comes back and forth to the Mandalay Bay, he goes back and forth into the casino because they're open 24/7. He's in there gambling, walking around. He's just carrying on with his day as he wants to. And then on that day at 7:30 in the morning, so bearing in mind he'd been up at 2 in the morning, at 7:30 in the morning he takes himself back to his room. But this is prior to then him going downstairs to do some more gambling and to get more luggage back up to his room. So that you can see it's well spaced out. He's not stupid. Like, you can see he's planned this very well. Because there's such a gap in between those times too. Stephen goes back to his car and moves that, and that was done, and that was the only transaction again in Mary Lou's name. As we go through, so we've seen him go back and forth, he's been gambling, and we are now moving into what happened, and you may want a trigger warning because this might be distressing to some people, especially if you've ever been involved in a similar situation or you don't want to hear the details. I will pop a timestamp in here so that you can skip forward, and then you can pick it up at the other side, because there will be a time by time mention as we go through, just so that you can see how quickly this played out and how much played out in such a short time. I'm going to show you a picture as well just above before we get going, that there is him with his suitcases going back to the room with the new cases at 12:29 in the afternoon that day. So at 12:33, so we've gone back to our room, he creates a room service ticket, and at 17 minutes past 1, the Mandalay Bay valet parking puts his car in the East Garage. That was the car that he recently had brought to the valet. At 13:37, the room service ticket in her name, Mary Lou, is closed, and the cheque for that is $67, and 2 entrees have been ordered. Between 4:23 and 7:40 p.m, the doors for the rooms on the room 134 and 135 are manipulated multiple times. So during the time that he's been in there, he's been doing things to help him be able to carry out this massacre, to cause delay, stop emergency services getting through, anything and that he can do to, be ahead of the game and slow things up. And obviously we also know that he'd set it up so he could see who was approaching. So at 20:40 there is an alarm that goes off, an SOS alarm, and this happens to be on the 32nd floor, but this is into room 129, so it's not his room, and this was assigned to a security officer called Campus, and he has his cell phone, which is common practice for them to then go and assign that to security staff when those kind of calls come through, and he's got the phone. At 21:36, a deadbolt to room 32 was engaged. At 21:40, James Aldean starts his performance, and then at 21:46, the security officer Campus enters the service elevator, and he takes himself off to the 30th floor, which is where the the alarm has gone off, and he walks into the stairway of that wing and tries to go up to the 32nd floor, but at this point he notices that he can't actually get into the 32nd floor this way. So he notices that the door's actually been barricaded and has actually had a lock on there. So Stephen Paddock has actually put on a lock on that door to stop anyone, I'm assuming emergency services and the police being his main target, to slow up so that they can't actually get onto that floor, to come to his room, to obviously stop him from doing what he's doing. So he notices that, and what we know as well is just outside his room there's a room service trolley outside the room, and there is a camera that's hidden in and amongst the plates and things that are on there. So you can see he's thought about this a lot. It's very calculated, and it's designed to help him create as much carnage as he can. I mean, it's going to be difficult for them to firstly figure out where the gunshots are coming from, but it's going to be even harder if the emergency services can't get up to his room to obviously stop him, and he obviously has eyes on them as well, so that he can react to them if he needs to. So to be able to get on that floor, the security officer has to go to the 33rd floor, walk down, and then take the guest elevator to the 32nd floor. And you can just see that that's a massive delay. It's a lot of faffing around to get to the 32nd floor where he needed to be. And bearing in mind, this was like an SOS alarm as well, so he's been delayed for that. So he gets through there, and then that's when he notices what's actually been done to the door. So he calls at 2204 the house phone, which is in the foyer, and leading to that stairwell, and calls dispatch and says to them that there's this bracket on the door and it's stopping security getting through. And so maintenance dispatcher is called via a supervisor cell phone. So you can see, even just getting someone up to the floor to come and take this lock off goes through various steps of various different calls before you even get to the person that needs to come up and to deal with that. At 2205, the engineer had been contacted by the maintenance dispatcher for the door, and at this point it is when Stephen Paddock opens fire. So I'm just going to put a timestamp here, because there will be footage and clips from that. So if you don't want to see this part or hear about this part, you can skip through to when the timestamp finishes. So he starts his firing, and he starts with the first two shots that go into the Las Vegas Village area.
But I'm a long way from broken. Should I stay? Just how long ago? I'm taking a long way home. Hey, sitting down, trying to trail in front of you. Asking you over still. Asking you over still. Guess you heard I was pedal to the metal on the wheels.
Hears what he thinks is like a rapid drilling noise, and at this point Stephen Paddock is firing hundreds of rounds of bullets. So initially, the security guard is thinking that he's hearing drilling, but it's bullets, and they are being directed into the area of the festival. So Campus begins to walk down the centre, because he's still oblivious to the fact that this is gunfire, and then the engineer is making his way up to the 32nd floor. At this point, obviously, this has been picked up outside, so you've got so much going on outside, and then you've obviously got things unfolding on the inside. But there is a announcement by the Metropolitan Police Department, so they're the Las Vegas Police Metropolitan Department, that they have shots fired, and that they think it sounds like an automatic firearm. So during this time, because he's got that security camera on that service table, he then can see the security guy coming down that way to his room. So he then shoots through the door, and the security officer actually gets shot in his left calf, and that's with a bullet fragment. So he then takes cover. There's like a little alcove, so he's able to take cover in there, and he then gets on to tell the dispatcher from his phone what's happened and the room number. And I think it's a kind of weird twist of fate, like a sliding doors moment, because the fact is he went off to go and deal with an alarm in room 129, which was found to be secure, but as a result of that, he was in the place at the right time, and as far as I know, they're not connected. He didn't trigger that alarm in that room, it was just that happened, and he happened to be there when Stephen Paddock opened fire. So I do think that's a weird twist of fate, because obviously him being there and finding him helps to slow to speed the process up to get the help, rather than it slowing the process down and people not knowing where this is all happening from and where it's all coming from, because he's telling people from the inside, who are then notifying the police on the outside, who have already been alerted, but they can't figure out where this gunfire is coming from. So I'm going to post the picture of the hallway upstairs and the table you'll see, and you can see it's just so meticulously planned out. So the engineer that had actually been dispatched to that floor, he started to obviously head up to that area, but while all this is still going on, at 22:07, so you can see in that short time there's more things happening. So Stephen is firing another approximate of about 95 rounds into that Vegas area of the festival, and the security officers, the other ones that worked at the Mandalay Bay, they too went out to go and help, obviously, with what was going on outside. But while this is happening, Stephen is still firing into the area, and another 100 rounds is fired into the people. At 22:08, Stephen Paddock actually makes his first round of bullets fire into a fuel tank, and this is at the international airport for Las Vegas, and just above here are the tanks that he fires at, and so lucky that they didn't explode. And the military police become involved, and they also enter a CAT event for that. So they're starting to form their operation on how they're going to go in and how they're going to deal with the situation, with the people that are on the ground that are being injured, and obviously with what is folding out inside. So, you know, they're pulling everything together and starting to be able to react with more resources and more support, which is vital, because obviously there's just so many people involved. There's all the victims, there's, you know, the staff, there's the police, there's paramedics, there's fire, you know, so they need to choreograph this really well to stop him and then get to the injured, and treat them. At 22:09, Stephen fires a second time at the fuel tank, and again, lucky it doesn't actually cause an explosion, and he attempts a third, fourth and a fifth round, and he even gives a sixth round at it, but you can see in the pictures where he has made those damages, and it's just fortunate that they didn't explode, because that would have been, you know, so much more worse. I mean, it was bad enough anyway, but it was calculated. He knew what he was doing. His aim was to kill as many people as he possibly could, and by creating that explosion, you know, you are going to cause mass casualties and mass deaths. So back into the Mandalay Bay at 22:10, the engineer arrives in the centre core of that floor. So you can see in the diagrams that I've shown, as we've been going through, that it's a very sort of, you know, different layout, if you like, and he starts to walk up to that way where Paddock's room is, and he hears what he thinks is a jackhammer sound. So you know, like the security officer, you know, he thought he was hearing drilling. This guy thinks he's hearing jackhammer, and it isn't. It's actually automatic gunfire. And I've said this on previous podcasts. You know, the first thing that people aren't going to think when they hear something like that, because they're never in a million years expecting that to be what it is when they hear the gunfire or the pop, 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 people think it's, you know, firecrackers, or they think it is fireworks. And it was very possible for the guys outside to think it was those, because it was a concert. But obviously inside, they're thinking they're just hearing, you know, drills. Because of course they're not going to be thinking it's gunfire. They just are not. And I'm not sure what communication there was, because obviously I would have thought they would have communicated that there was gunfire and they were sending this other chap up to an area where there was gunfire. But I'm not 100% sure on what sort of goes on in between him arriving up to that floor. So in this time, Stephen is firing quite heavily into the festival.
Automatic weapon. We know now that more than 50 people have been killed and more than 200 were wounded in that shooting, making it the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Sheriff Joseph Lombardo confirmed the shooter is now dead, and police do not believe there are any other shooters involved in the incident. The gunfire started.
Then the gunfire halts, and the security guard is taking cover, and the engineer guy also, obviously, then when realises what's happening, they take cover as well, and these are in the alcoves between room 117 and 119, and at this point Stephen is just firing down that corridor to try and prevent them from obviously getting to his room. He obviously doesn't want them in there. He's very much in control. He wants this to play out how he wants it to play out, but there's, it's just, I can't explain how meticulous this guy has thought this through, but there is a call that is made over on the radio, and they want to notify the police that actually someone is firing guns from the 32nd floor. So at 22:11, the Las Vegas police arrive in the centre core area of the 31st floor. So you've got some on the 31st floor and some on the there's some making their way up to obviously the 32nd floor. There's a bunch of security officers from the Mandalay Bay, and while they're kind of taking form, taking their places, communicating with each other, there's another 80 to 100 rounds fired into the Las Vegas concert area. At 22:12, on the security exit, the guest elevator, they take that and they come into the core area of that floor, of the 32nd floor, and again, Stephen is firing another 80 to 90 rounds. He fires so many rounds of bullets so quickly into this festival area because it's so so open. it's even where he can't see people, so like where there's tents and things, he can still shoot at people because obviously he's just firing blindly anyway, and obviously through shelter like the tents and stuff, they're not going to protect anyone, so he's just continuing to fire. 2 police officers are struck during that incident. He goes to fire at the officer, the security officer, and Officer Hendricks. And there was actually a report. There was a couple of police officers on the 31st floor that I mentioned when they first came in, and it was actually raised that one of them lost his job because he was actually hesitant, because they didn't actually move from the 31st floor. At 22:13, Paddock begins firing again, and at this point they've lost count of how many rounds have been fired. At 22:15, he fires 2 separate rounds again, of an unknown amount, and Austin Hendricks, who is one of the officers, and a couple of security officers begin to make their way into the stairwell so that they can reach the 32nd floor via that gas elevator. But neither of the officer has heard the gunfire at this point. At 22:56, the strike team have re-entered the stairwell on the 31st floor for taking themselves up to the 32nd. At 22:57, the sergeant in charge and the SWAT officer manually breach the door that's been barricaded with the L bracket so that those who are making their way up can get to the 32nd floor without losing time of going around the houses to come on to the 32nd floor. At 23:20, the strike team conduct an explosive breach into Stephen Paddock's room. which is just above in that video.
Looks like it might be a camera of some sort.
Rip it out.
Huh? What did it take?
Multiple cameras. You got a camera on the bottom and on top. You got a connection
Hold on.
Hold on. Relax. You got a connection in the room behind you guys.
Okay, I'm gonna hold on this door. Okay.
Rifle. Pull to the right. Look, I got door. Door is long. Pull right, hold up, move up. What do you want? Hands!
Okay, cover on that. In with you.
Cover on this door, it's with you. Right here, this door is with you. Those are cameras pointing down the hallway. Clear. Check under the bed.
Thompson, I'm covering.
Watch these closets, watch your back.
I got the.
You got it?
I checked them. Just watch that. I'm gonna put a leak on that door.
Copy that. Hold. Where those shots come from? Was that us? You remember, front window, right where the right door. Right where that curtain is, right past the door.
This guy's in here. So who's calling these in? I wonder.
No, you self-inflict this.
I'm really thinking this is just a one-guy thing, switching guns.
So, but what about all the other calls? Is that just people panicking and freaking out, or?
Yeah, it sounds like.
And you can see how they manage that. You can hear them say breach, and then there's the explosion, and that takes the door out. When they walk in, they immediately see that Stephen Paddock is deceased, and he is on the floor with an apparent self-inflicted gun wound to his head. At 23:26, the strike team make a second explosive breach into the other room, which is his interconnecting room. And that ends the incident of, obviously, the firing into the public. They've got their man. Well, they haven't got him. He's taken himself. He's taken his own life, so he's taken himself out of the equation. He's made that decision, and I think that on his behalf is an element of control, and I think I agree with his brother that he would have wanted this to have worked out exactly how he wanted it to, including whether or not he was taken by force and arrested and jailed, or whether he takes his own life. So while this is all playing out inside the Mandalay Bay, you can see there's so much that's happened from when that alarm goes off to finding the door in the stairwell locked, to then obviously thinking they're hearing drilling, to call in for support to come and take that lock off the door, to obviously then hearing gunfire, to being shot. All this is played out. There's communication going on, and then obviously that communication is helping the teams that are outside trying to deal with what's going on, because as we know, initially they couldn't be sure. They just knew that this gunfire was coming from an elevated position, and there was they couldn't see, because it was dark as well, so you couldn't see that window, which the next day you can see that window was smashed, which I'll show shortly, but you can't see where this gunfire is coming from, just that it's from this elevated position. And the police are trying to direct them as best they can, but obviously with everything that's gone on the inside, at that some point they are able to communicate exactly where this is all happening and where this is all coming from. But as you can imagine, there's so much confusion, and when that firing first starts, Jason Aldean, he leaves the stage. You can see in this video that I'm showing you, he just looks shocked. It's like initially, again, it's that fireworks thing, and then he realizes that it's not. And obviously, as people are being shot and injured and fall into the ground, people start to scream and panic. So it's so much more difficult to control the crowd as well, because they're panicking, they're running in all different directions, and at this point, in this early phase of what's going on, they're wanting to get to safety, but there is no way of knowing where that safety is. So the police are trying to be shielding themselves behind cars, their own cars. They're trying to get the public to shield behind walls or whatever they can to get themselves some form of protection. And in this clip above here, but I'm now going to show you, you can see just how chaotic that was and where people were running from. They were just running here, there and everywhere.
Alright, what y'all say we pick it back up just a little bit?
Christ, that was real? Off my live stream. We'll see what that was real? Hey, people hold it. Everybody out! Everybody out! Slow down! Slow down! Slow down! Everybody out! Quietly! Slow down! Everybody out! Everybody out! Slow down! Go! Copy. 1797 means that is going to be a light on Mandalay Bay, not shots up from the Mandalay Bay, but it's coming from that direction. Everybody out! Everybody out! Everybody out! Just one outside. They can get back here. Everybody get out! Everybody get out! Everybody get out! Everybody get out! Get out! Go! Go! Everybody go! Hey, Mark!
Hey, you guys, you go that way. No, don't go out there. Go down that way.
So once they've got their communication in place, and they know where the shots are being fired from, they can then start to come in and be more meticulous. They know where the gunfire is coming from, so they know where to hide people. They know roughly where the gunfire is aiming down at them, so where they can see a safe place, that's where they're directing them, and they're directing them away from the area where people are basically sitting targets over there. So Jason Aldean has run off. People have now started to panic. They're reacting to what's going on. People are trying to help people despite what's going on and despite the danger to themselves, and others are just running in a panic. So as you can imagine, it's just chaos and panic. And if you're with someone that's been injured, do you leave them? Do you stay? What happens when the people were with someone that was shot and they instantly passed away? I can't imagine what that was like to be there. Like, I can't imagine, and because everybody's running everywhere, it's so difficult to manage. And there was an incident of a young lady who was with her mum, and there was someone there who was like a firefighter. He was an off-duty emergency services personnel, and her mum had been shot, and he basically said, you have to go, you have to leave your mum. I'll pop the interview just up here. But as you see, he basically says, you've got to go, otherwise you're going to end up being shot and possibly die, and we don't want that. I'm going to stay with your mum. So he promises her that he is going to stay with her mum because she's injured.
This is the first time since that fateful night that Paige Melanson is seeing the man who helped save her mother's life.
There's my angel.
My mother is alive because of you.
Paige FaceTiming with retired LA firefighter Don Matthews, who happened to come across her and her family and told them they needed to go.
But I promised your daughters I would be there with her.
Yes, you
did.
did.
And you did, and you kept your promise. I knew you would, but oh.
Her mother shot in the torso, Matthews insisting that he stay with her instead of Paige and her sister so they could flee for their lives.
So, thank goodness from all of the action from the staff in the Mandalay Bay, reacting as quick as they did, because as you can see, the timeline moves very fast. There's not huge gaps between any of it. The only thing I would argue is that calling the service person to come resolve the bolt that's blocking the stairway. There seems to be a bit of a got to call this person to then call that person. That's a bit of a delay, but in the grand scheme of things, would it have made a difference if it just went through one person in terms of timing? I don't know. And I think once they gain that knowledge of where the shootings are coming from, that enables them to let the police know, and then people can be direct, they can start managing the situation so much better. And the next phase of that, because obviously we know Stephen has shot himself, there is then the job of helping the injured, the wounded, figuring out who needs the quickest care, who's deceased, because you've got to remember as well, after this it's a crime scene, but I'm guessing people, as people have gone down, if they've been injured or shot, if they're with a loved one, they've probably tried to move them and that kind of thing. But I think with everything being carried out as quick as it did, I think it possibly saved there being more deaths than there were, and more injuries than they were. And again, I go back to that sliding moment, that door moment where something sent that alarm to go off, and for that security officer to be on the floor. One of the amazing things as well that happened, and this happens a lot in situations like this, is that the community pull together, and people are trying to help the wounded, stop the bleeding. People that weren't at the festival that had cars were literally putting people into their cars and driving them to the nearest hospital, just so that they could help out. And obviously the emergency services were obviously doing their bit, and ambulances and things were obviously taking the injured as well.
Hey, right now, we need your truck. We just need to get people over to the hospital, okay?
Okay, go ahead, put them all in the back.
And they had set up a triage, but it is amazing how, despite what people are seeing, just normal everyday people that haven't seen, somebody shot or injured before, where there's potentially lots of blood, how adrenaline kicks in and they go into protective mode, active, they're going in and trying to do whatever they can to help that person. Some people may have never come across a deceased body before, and they may have, they may have been, checking that, there are a lot of shootings, and so even with the people that come across stuff on a daily basis, what they will have seen at this festival will have just been a lot for them as well. And when I'm watching the interviews with people, you can see that they're upset. Hospital staff that see injured people, watch people die, they have been so affected by this, and it's only natural that that's going to happen. So prior to them finding Stephen and knowing that he'd taken his own life, there were rumours, like with everything, you know, when these things pan out and they start coming out into the public, that there was more than one shooter. There were conspiracy theories where people thought there was someone on the 4th floor, and videos that looked like there was a little flash, so it was like they were thinking that there was, you know, that was like gunfire. And that happens with everything. When things like this happen, people start to put things that perhaps weren't there, and especially because the chaos of not knowing where everything was, you know, the gunfire was coming from, and not knowing where the bullets were coming from, you can see why people might confuse that with, you know, there being more than one shooter, especially at the rate that Paddock was firing those bullets as well, because that's a lot of firearms to be able to shoot. So you can see why people, you know, they put that into their head that there has to be more than one, and then they believe it, and then, you know, they have to obviously investigate that. So if people are saying there's more than one shooter, obviously the police are going to go and see if that is the case, and they quickly put a stop to that rumour. That's not actually what happened. And I can remember when this was playing out, initially they were looking for Mary Lou, and they put her picture on the news but as a person of interest, not realising that she was actually in the Philippines. And she actually came back quite quickly. They asked her to come back because they wanted to interview her. They wanted to find out about Stephen. They wanted to know if there was any signs that she knew, if she was part of this. And obviously when, you know, they learn about the bank transfer and that kind of thing. So she was quite quick to return back to America, and she was met by the FBI. Obviously at this point, nobody knows why this has happened. Nobody knew that this was going to happen. And they needed to know if she knew this was going to happen, and she didn't. She was aware he had a sizable gun collection, and again, in America, it's not unusual. We know that you can go and buy guns readily available. So to her, you know, he's probably just spending his money, and she's not thinking, oh, he's buying these guns and he's going to do this kind of thing. She just knows that, you know, and from the behaviours that I've heard about him, he was probably a bit, as we say in the UK, a bit of a cantankerous old git, and she probably just kind of let him get on with his things that he did, you know, his hobbies, and she probably just didn't think too much of it. The duration from this entire event, from the start of gunfire, was 11 minutes. So from around 22:05 to 22:16, 11 minutes of absolute carnage and massacre. And he was able to do that because it was well planned, well thought out, to do as much damage in as short a space of time that he would be able to do that. And it's just so, it just makes me feel cold just thinking about that. And you often find with perpetrators who do these things, when they look into these things, you know, people just don't expect their loved one to do something like that, and there's often a disbelief, and especially with how he planned this out as well. But again, Eric, his brother, said that this is what he would do. Like, he would want to be known to have been the biggest mass shooter. And that says a lot about Stephen Paddock, doesn't it? And so he's done his absolute best to fulfill that of himself. In that time, there were 61 deaths in total. Some of them weren't immediate, some of them were actually a bit of time after, but they were deaths that were attributed to what happened to them at this concert, and he was included in that number. 867 people were injured. 413 of those were by gunfire shrapnel. And he used 24 firearms. 24. When they spoke to Mary Lou, she did say, now why this didn't trigger anything in her to think this was something a bit odd, but then he is a bit odd, that he had cased out the Vegas village from different windows in that room where they'd stayed in there a month before together. And obviously, you know, we've looked at his movements in the other locations, but, you know, his brother didn't know that. She didn't know that. It's only post-event, you pull all this together, that you can just see what's happened. And again, I say hindsight is a wonderful thing. We know he had previously researched online large-scale venues in different places. He obviously didn't go to them and he didn't follow through. The one he went to was the Ogden, and then ended up in the Mandalay Bay, which is, I'm going to say, he probably knew that that was going to give him the biggest death rate. In preparation for the shooting, Stephen actually brought 5 suitcases to his room on September the 25th. He brought 7 cases in on the 26th, and 2 on the 28th, and 6 on the 30th, and then 2 more on the 1st of October. During the shooting, Stephen fired over 1,000 rounds. Over 1,000 rounds. It doesn't seem possible, but he did. The rounds went to the distance of about 490 yards, which is 450 metres converted, into that audience. And initially he was like a couple of shots, so it wasn't so blatantly obvious to start with. Then, you know, people aren't looking and thinking that this is weird. They're thinking it's start of fireworks or firecrackers, and he knew exactly what he was doing, because then obviously he then lets rip. So much damage, so many lives were lost, so many injured, so much confusion, and the medical teams worked tirelessly to help save as many people as they, you know, could, and help the injured. And I'm going to show the interview here.
There's probably 100 to 200 people in our trauma unit. Patients were not only in all the gurneys, there were patients in the middle on gurneys, there were people on the walls in chairs, there were people outside in chairs.
Currently, we've seen over 100 patients that were came into the trauma center. We have 20 that were critical and over a dozen that required surgery right away, and went to the operating room immediately with our staff, and others that are currently still in the hospital being managed with chest tubes and pain control issues and things like that, and wounds that they're suffered from the gunshot.
Because we deal with trauma every day, seeing a gunshot wound is what we see quite often, unfortunately, but it was just the sheer volume. So we created different areas. We had triage out front, we opened up our ambulatory care center, our post-operative care unit, and our pre-anesthesia unit for the walking wounded and for other patients that needed less care.
we know that adrenaline kicks in, and even some of the people that would have been shot, some of them didn't know that they had been shot, because some of them described like a burning sensation but never thought that they'd been shot. And I think that's the adrenaline that kicks in, because a lot of people then feel it afterwards and then realise what's happened. But everything that was done, including the help that the public did by dropping those people off, going back and taking more people to the hospital, for everything that the emergency services did, even if that guy who was the police officer who froze, I mean, he was an older gentleman anyway, he's a human being, and he panicked, and he is really sorry for that. But actually, I don't think that impacted the amount of time Stephen Paddock still had. He did this in 11 minutes. And that's just my thoughts on that. That could have impacted it, I don't know. But my thoughts is that he did this in 11 minutes. One scared police officer being a little bit hesitant, and being on the wrong floor, and being careful, I don't think changed. You know, you wouldn't have shaved off any time for that, because he shot himself anyway. And the community, again, just amazing. People needed blood. Blood is, you know, it's people don't donate enough blood as it is, so blood is in short supply, and the community go to the hospital and they give blood for the victims that have lost a lot of blood, that need the blood.
Stained floor of a Las Vegas hospital shows the desperate situation the city was in after the mass shooting at an outdoor concert. It also shows the need for blood donations, and thousands of people have answered the call for help.
I got here at 4:30 in the morning, and I still haven't donated yet.
Shonda Maloney is one of them. She lives in Las Vegas and said she rushed to the scene to help in any way she could.
And people are just driving these people and dropping them off. And that's amazing. Again, that's that community that they're pulling together. So you've got people, you know, helping people get to hospital, people giving their blood to help in any way that they can. And I take my hats off to them, and I think if I was there, I would be giving my blood. And I think it's certainly a situation where people who don't donate their blood, maybe it's time, you know, if that's something you've ever thought of doing, donating your blood, because you could, you know, you're going to save a life, because blood, especially the negative blood types as well, if it's something that you're thinking of doing or ever thought of doing, definitely think about that. And, you know, if it's something you want to do, definitely go sign up for that wherever you are in the world. If you can give blood, that's blood that can save someone's life. They had to shut the airport because we know that the tanks were damaged, and thankfully damaged was all that happened there. So they had to shut that off. They had to reroute 25 different flights because obviously planes have fuel. And so by closing that down, that prevents another mass incident, because obviously, you know, the amount of fuel these planes carry, you know, if these tanks had gone and then the flights were there, and do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a whole disaster on its own. So they closed it and just rerouted everything. Once they'd started to redirect people, once they'd got people to the hospital, once obviously they'd confirmed that they had the only suspect that they had on record to find, there was no other suspect. It's then the crime scene, and obviously there are going to be deceased bodies on this crime scene at this point when they're looking at this the victims, the injured, they've all been kind of taken where they need to be, and you are just left with this photo up here where you can just see how it was left, how people just left everything and they ran for their lives. And so you've got to preserve the crime scene, and no doubt, you know, that's how they came to know the numbers of the bullets used, and how far, you know, people were when they were shot and died. So the aftermath is then the next hardest, because they want a reason why this has happened, and they've got to notify victims' families, because obviously people that know that they've got friends, families in this concert are going to be panicking, and it's not going to be easy because obviously there's hundreds of injured, and so they've then got the job of identifying the bodies and preserving the crime scene. And what transpires, sadly, at the end of all of this, there are no answers. There's speculation, as I've mentioned. Stephen got into debt, and that's what that's the best they can come up with, because there was no note why he did anything, no reason, no real suspicion, and his family were totally shocked by it. So nobody got answers when they was, you know, carrying out their investigation. When they breached into the room, they did find that there was a hammer in there, and that was what he used to break those windows. They did find the handwritten note that I mentioned, which is a picture just above, but it wasn't in depth. There was no, I did this because, you know, he hadn't been known to have like such severe mental health issues that people were aware of, but nevertheless they still carried out a thorough investigation, but sadly there was just no answer. And Stephen Paddock's brother Eric was like, you know, in some ways I hope they find on an autopsy he has a brain tumour, because there'll be an answer. But his autopsy was clear. There was nothing in his autopsy that gave any clue as to what happened, just obviously how he died. And I do believe they sent his brain off for further research. In a press conference that followed, the Sheriff Joe Lombardi, he was one of the ones that would be coming to the media and giving updates, and he suggests there may have been a possible plan for him to try and escape, but he didn't go into much more detail other than that. And they found some stuff like a bulletproof vest and then some breathing apparatus. Now I do not know what that breathing apparatus was for. It's a bit of an odd thing because it's like something for underwater, and he wasn't underwater. All the conspiracy theories dispelled and cleared up, and there was only one shooter. There had been conspiracy theories from people outside law enforcement to say that the police were actually conspiring with MGM Resorts and the FBI, fiddling with the timelines to try and reflect on the incident quite differently. But even still, you know, if timelines have been slightly altered, notes on reflection, that's normal. That happens because timings aren't going to be specifically 100% unless you're the person clocking the time on the radio. You've got the dispatcher on the other end typing as things are happening. But if you're on the ground, 100% you're not going to be like, oh, like, right, it's 22:10, fire, or it's going to be motion and you're going to have a rough idea of the time. So I can see why, if there was time changes, there could be a reason why that was. And again, that was dispelled. Things are stressful, you know. Even in my career as a midwife, when you reflect back on things, you know, sometimes you have to edit something that you've written because you recall it. You think when you go back and reflect on things, you're like, no, and then you have to, but you state that you've, on reflection, written the notes to reflect this because, you know, due to the events of whatever, you hadn't had that come to the forefront of your mind. So as long as you're acknowledging that it's an amendment and it's a reflective piece, that happens, and it's to be expected in, you know, high tension stress situations like that. Initially in the primary investigation back in January 2018, they said that Stephen had worked alone, and they were trying to get a motive, and we know they didn't get one. They found there was no ties to any hate groups, terrorism groups, anything like that, because ISIS actually tried to claim him as one of their soldiers, and they never showed any proof for that. The police actually ended up charging the gun dealer in Arizona. He was seen as conspiring to manufacture and sell armour, piercing ammunition without a licence to do so. And he actually received 13 months in prison for his part in that. Now, obviously, when he was selling this stuff, he was not expecting that man to go and do what he did. The final report, which is the discovery, which is where, you know, all the timings and everything came for. The investigation was documented as lasting as 10 months, and there was no evidence of a conspiracy theory or anyone else being involved. No motive. People didn't have the answers, and, you know, when people have lost people or they've been severely injured or hurt, people want answers, and it kind of helps with the process of moving on. But unfortunately, that they didn't get that closure. Dale Hendricks was the police officer who was fired, and he was actually reinstated back in his job. I just wanted to kind of put that in there as well, because they looked at the situation as a whole, and they know that police officers are human like everybody else. And I'd be interested to know what your thoughts and theories are on whether or not you think he should have remained fired, or whether him being reinstated was the right thing. You know, everybody's going to have a different opinion on that. But as I said, I don't think it actually had a massive effect on the response time, because Paddock had got this timed perfectly well. Now the Mandalay Bay has actually skipped floor 32, so floor 32 doesn't exist, and the rooms that he used have actually now been sealed off, and they are not accessible to the guests.
So this here is the old 32nd floor. That is what used to be 32135. 32134. If you look now, it's now a key lock. And they've just covered over the doorway. This is how close RVMPD were when they opened the foyer door. And here's an interesting point.
There was a lawsuit brought against MGM because it was claimed that there was negligence on their part for allowing Stephen to be back and forth with the suitcases and not pulling him up on that. And again, that's a hindsight thing. You know, when someone blends in like that, and without all the other outside factors, you know, it's going to be hard for them to go, oh, he's taken those suitcases up there. That's really suspicious. And they actually reached a settlement. They did try and countersue the victims, which I heavily disagree with. They said it was a legal move, but in the end, they settled for $8 million for the victims of the shootings, and this was finally finalised at the end of September, which that's quite, you know, that's a long time when you're a victim of something like this to finally have some form of closure, because that's the only form of closure that they're gonna get. It's such a difficult case. As you can see, there's so much stuff that's gone on behind what's happened. We've talked about the planning. We've seen that he has the diagrams. We know there's no answer to why he has done what he has done. It's sad, tragic, and such a large loss of life. Obviously, Mary Lou probably lives with a lot of guilt for not realising or noticing something very different, and obviously she's lost him, so, you know, having lost Stephen, then realised what he was actually capable of, that's a lot of emotions. His family totally shocked, his mum totally shocked, but it's really difficult. I did find it odd that Mary Lou noticed a change in his behaviour, but I feel like he is an odd character. I feel like his brother is a bit of an odd character, and I get the impression that she probably didn't really know what he was up to on a full sort of level. I think he probably was quite private. He's unique. But it all goes back to his childhood. You've got to look at their situation. You can't blame that. I mean, people have had shitty childhoods, but they don't do something like this. And he seemed to be the caring person for his brothers. So what happened? Was it the fact that he'd lost a lot of money and perhaps maybe he couldn't continue to support his family in the way he wanted to? I don't know. We won't ever know. So when you look at the interview with his brother, what are your thoughts? I would be so interested to know, because I kind of thought he was odd. The way he spoke about his brother's grave or ashes, I found that very odd. But it's, you know, it's probably just their personality, and when I'm looking at him and watching him, I find him odd, but it could be a culmination of oddity and shock, because I kind of think he went out there and done those interviews and wasn't prepared for it. He just kind of opened the door and went out and, you know, addressed the reporters, and he was out there for a good 30 minutes. So that about wraps up this case today, the case of Stephen Paddock and the mass shooting in Las Vegas. It's a long one, I know, so thank you for, you know, listening all the way through. I hope you got value from this. maybe something about the case that perhaps you didn't know. I know there's not many kind of videos and things on this, and that's one of the reasons why I want to cover mass shootings, because actually a lot of the crime channels that I've seen don't cover mass shootings. They tend to stick to murder cases, and so I want to give you guys a variety. But that's basically that wrapped up, and I'd just be so interested to hear your thoughts on, you know, what you think happened, why you think these things happened, whether you thought he was going to do this in more than one place, or whether you thought he was going to try and escape. So yeah, I will always try to go through the comments and see what has been said and respond where I can, and you know, have we can have conversations. Do you know someone that was there? You know, what do you know about it? Is there something that I've not mentioned that that you can tell me? But absolutely, I recommend the Discovery. I hope it was interesting, and my thoughts go to the victims who lost their lives, their families, who lost their friends, their loved ones. My thoughts go out to anyone who was involved, including the medics, just for the long-term trauma that these people will have endured, and just members of the public who helped. As I say always, if you see something, say something. If something looks odd, out of place, say something. It's better to say something and it be nothing than say nothing and then realise it was something. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and if you haven't yet seen my attack on Seuss Beach, the terror attack, there's a video on the end there, which I think I'm going to pop on the end here. It primarily talks about being away and safety, but you can apply this to anywhere that you're at, especially as this is more frequent and becoming more frequent. So I might share that on the end here so that you guys can watch that, so that you can keep yourselves safe. Hope to see you very soon on the next podcast. Goodbye, everyone.